Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. Part 13. Trade and Trepanation. In the 122nd year of the Common Reckoning, Alberus Dogface, the ruler of Dogopolis, got a headache. The palace doctor examined Alberos and pronounced that he was suffering from congestion of the skull, caused by a surfeit of blood in the head. Based on this diagnosis, in accordance with the standard medical practice prevalent in Dogopolis at this time, the doctor recommended opening a vein in Alberos' arm and relieving Alberos of a quart of his blood. A silver bleeding bowl and a surgical knife were brought into Alberos' chamber, and the doctor made a suitable incision. The blood flowed copiously, much to the doctor's satisfaction. Soon the bowl was brimming, and the doctor bound up Alberos' arm. But Alberos still had a headache. The following day the headache was no better, and the doctor relieved Alberos of another quart of blood. But still the headache resolutely refused to dissipate. Alberos dismissed the palace doctor and sought a second opinion. His new physician confirmed the diagnosis of congestion of the skull, but he recommended a different and more direct treatment. Rather than relieving the internal pressure indirectly, by removing blood from Alberos' arm, he argued for relieving it directly, by trepanning. The headache was severe, even to the point where Alberos agreed to allow his new doctor to drill a hole in the top of his head, and the operation was successful. The headache was cured. Unfortunately for Alberos, he did not enjoy his newfound health for long. One of the cuts that his original doctor had made for the purpose of bleeding him became infected, and within a week Alberos Dogface was dead. He was succeeded as the ruler of Dogopolis by his son, Aristos, known by one and all as the Puppy. Now, one might expect that someone nicknamed the Puppy would be young, loud, and empty-headed. But this was not so. Aristos was in his late 30s. He spoke little and laughed less. He decisively seized his inheritance and ruthlessly consolidated his position. Having eliminated the internal threats to his rule, Aristos turned his attention to foreign affairs. Altes, the king of New Lyxia, and his eldest son Abbas had drowned the previous year, and public opinion in New Lyxia was firmly of the opinion that their deaths were the result of a Dogopolitan plot. 3 weeks prior to the demise of Alberos, a New Lyxian mob had given concrete expression to this belief by setting afire a Dogopolitan merchant ship that was tied up at a New Lyxian quayside, having previously killed all the crew and looted all the cargo. Indeed, some said that it was the tidings of this event that had caused the headache that had ultimately led to Alberos' untimely end. Whether or not he blamed the New Lyxians for the death of his father, Aristos sent his troops down to the harbour of Dogopolis, where there were 3 New Lyxian merchant ships lying at anchor. These ships were not burned, but they were impounded, their cargoes confiscated, and their crews imprisoned. Now, merchants are reluctant to visit ports where they may be robbed, murdered, or imprisoned without trial, and so the result of these events was the cessation of the maritime trade between New Lyxia and Dogopolis. The populace of Dogopolis was delighted that their new leader had shown the New Lyxians that Dogopolis was not to be messed with. But the fashionable young women of Dogopolis bemoaned the unavailability of New Lyxian lace. The farmers of Dogopolis grumbled that they could no longer export their wine and olives at premium prices, but had to sell them cheaply in the oversupplied domestic market, or trade them with the notoriously unreliable goblins. The merchants of Dogopolis were unhappy because they had lost the primary part of their income. And Aristos was not only faced with rising discontent among his subjects, but also with the loss of the greater part of his revenue, which had come from harbour fees and import duties. But Aristos was not concerned. He had a brother-in-law named Adrastos, who was one of the leading merchants of Dogopolis. And Adrastos had done a lot of business with a man named Mithildes, who was one of the leading merchants of New Lyxia, and, despite the enmity between Dogopolis and New Lyxia, Adrastos and Mithildes had contrived to remain in contact, and, with Aristos' blessing, Adrastos and Mithildes had come to an arrangement. Now, some say that Mithildes was married to one of the granddaughters of Bulis, and it was the death of Bulis at the hands of his brother Alberos Dogface that had led to the exile of Alberos and the founding of Dogopolis. Indeed, much of the continuing distrust and enmity in New Lyxia toward the Dogopolitans could be traced to this history. There was no love lost between the house of Bulis and that of Alberos Dogface. But this did not seem to affect the relationship between Mithildes and Adrastos. Maybe this was because they had married into these houses, rather than having directly inherited the blood feud. Or maybe they valued profit above family traditions. In any case, Adrastos purchased many goods at Dogopolis and loaded up his ships, and Mithildes did likewise in New Lyxia. On the south coast of Halfland, midway between New Lyxia and Dogopolis, where the eastern slopes of the heaps ran down to the sea, there was a sheltered bay, and it was here that the ships of Adrastos and Mithildes beached. Dealing was done, and then the ships of Mithildes returned to New Lyxia, laden with Dogopolitan goods, and the ships of Adrastos returned to Dogopolis, laden with New Lyxian goods. Adrastos paid his harbour fees and import duties to Aristos, which made Aristos happy, and the trade between New Lyxia and Dogopolis resumed, pretty much as before. But not quite as before. Adrastos and Mithildes built wharves and warehouses in that bay at the foot of the heaps, and a port grew there, which was known as Midhaven. And if a ship owner other than Adrastos or Mithildes tried to trade at that port, his ship would be looted and burned. And if he tried to sail his ship along that coast, his ship would be intercepted by the ships of Adrastos and Mithildes, boarded and forcibly sailed into Midhaven, where it would be looted and burned. And so it was that Adrastos and Mithildes obtained a monopoly of trade between New Lyxia and Dogopolis. In the east of Halfland, the orcs were multiplying on the coast of the inland sea and pushing southward up the river Aukenflood until they reached the area where the western crags of the Wolf Rock Mountains descended into the rolling hills of the Goblin Downs. And here occurred the first encounters between orcs and goblins. The initial reaction of the goblins to meeting orcs was one of curiosity, both regarding the nature and culture of the orcs and how these might be turned to the goblins' advantage. However, it very soon became clear to the goblins that there were no advantages to be had. Any dealings with orcs would only be detrimental. The brutality of the orcs' reaction to the goblins will come as no surprise. After all, Orcan society was built on a foundation of violence and slavery. It is therefore not surprising that orcs regarded the goblin settlements as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. Bands of orcs wandered the Goblin Downs, stealing anything that was portable and burning anything that was not. But in one area the behaviour of the orcs was somewhat unexpected. The orcs made no attempt to enslave goblins, but instead mercilessly slaughtered any goblins that they encountered. The reason for this appears to be that the orcs were viscerally disgusted by the goblins. Above all, the orcs valued physical strength and brute force. The goblins were small and physically weak. They typically sought to bargain rather than fight, and to orcan eyes they appeared deformed and unhealthy, both in a corporal and a moral sense. As one orc put it, these misshapen abominations are not even fit to be the slaves of orcs. Now, goblins are not stupid. Rather than remaining in the northern regions of the Goblin Downs, those goblins resident in that area who had so far avoided a fatal encounter with a wandering group of murderous orcs decided to relocate southward. The country became increasingly depopulated, and the orcs had to venture ever further in search of victims. There was an orc named Dorga who observed this and decided that he couldn't be bothered with the additional travel. Instead, he and his slaves set up camp at the foot of the Goblin Downs and attacked parties of orcs returning from those hills laden with booty stolen from the goblins. This tactic proved remarkably successful, and soon Dorga had accumulated vast quantities of wealth and large numbers of slaves. He used this position to intimidate the other orcs in the neighbourhood into acknowledging him as their king, and he planned to march upon Orkenhome and install himself as king of all the orcs. But his plans changed. Goblin goods were not finished to a high standard. Goblins prioritised function over appearance. But the orcs began to notice that some of the artefacts they liberated from the goblins were finely tooled. Although there were no vineyards or olive groves in the Goblin Downs, the orcs found amphorae of wine and olive oil in goblin dwellings, and they pondered on these things. Dorga sent a party of orcs into the Goblin Downs, with orders to bring back some prisoners. The prisoners were then interrogated. The questioning was not conducted in a gentle manner, and I am afraid that none of the prisoners survived it. But during the process, the orcs learned of the existence and location of Dogopolis. Dorga decided to pick this apparently low-hanging fruit. And so, in the 128th year of the Common Reckoning, Dorga led an army of 1,000 orcs in a southwesterly direction along the northern edge of the Goblin Downs, directly toward Dogopolis. Although there was much distrust on both sides, and occasional outbreaks of violence, the Dogopolitans had maintained trading links with the goblins. News of the depredations inflicted upon the goblins by the orcs had therefore reached Dogopolis, but the areas of the Goblin Downs being ravaged by the orcs were remote from Dogopolis, and while the Dogopolitans were interested to hear what was happening, they were not concerned by it. This changed when Dorga's army reached Dogopolitan territory and started to ransack Dogopolitan farms and enslave Dogopolitan farmers. Aristos called up all eligible citizens for immediate military service. Within 2 days he had raised an army of 750 men, which he immediately marched out to intercept Dorga. The opposing forces met on the eastern fringes of Arginicum forest. Dorga died on the field. But although Aristos survived the battle, his army did not. The orcs won a comprehensive victory. Aristos fled back to Dogopolis. A further 500 men had mustered in his absence, and the following day he led these westward to Midhaven. Many more fled the city, some following in Aristos' footsteps, and others heading eastward into the Goblin Downs. 2 days after Aristos' departure, the Orcs arrived. The following weeks were not pleasant for the citizens of Dogopolis. The Orcs embarked on an orgy of rape, murder, and pillage. Once they had looted everything of value and enslaved the surviving inhabitants, they fell to fighting among themselves over the spoils. Eventually, the situation stabilized, with the city and its surroundings divided up between a number of Orcan warlords, who were happy to live in comfort off their new-found wealth, eschewing further wars of conquest in favour of occasional bouts of violent bickering with their peers. The population was half of what it had been, and the remnants of the previous population were now the slaves of the incomers. For many of these new slaves life was miserable, but not for all. Orcan society did not discriminate based on ethnicity. Freedom and power was obtainable by any slave who adopted Orcan ways, and who was strong and violent enough to kill his way up the Orcan hierarchy, and some did so. Aristos marched his army into Midhaven and took control of it. Neither Adrastos nor Myrtildes opposed him. Myrtildes was only interested in Midhaven as a staging post for the trade between New Lixia and Dogopolis, and with the fall of Dogopolis that trade had ceased. With no profits to be made, Myrtildes removed his ships to New Lixia and started to look for alternative markets. Adrastos did not have the option of relocating to another port. He had lost many assets in the sack of Dogopolis, and his remaining wealth was all at Midhaven. If the Orcs attacked and looted Midhaven, he would be ruined. He could not defend Midhaven from the Orcs, but Aristos and his army of 500 men could at least try to do so. And he was in no position to prevent Aristos from taking over. Given the options available to him, he was happy to step back and place himself under Aristos' protection. After all, it kept things in the family. Over the following days, Midhaven received a steady influx of refugees from Dogopolis. Aristos divided the land around the port into plots, and oversaw the resettlement of the new arrivals. His administration was effective, firm, and mostly fair, and he was respected for it. A couple of months after the fall of Dogopolis, a small, crudely constructed boat arrived in Midhaven. The boat had but a single occupant, and he told the following tale. Not all the refugees from Dogopolis had headed westward to Midhaven. A group of over 1,500, under the leadership of Adrastos' second son, Croesus, had headed east into the Goblin Downs. At first the goblins had been friendly, selling them the provisions that they required, encouraging them to travel deeper into the hills, talking of empty lands further on where the Dogopolitans could settle. But no matter how far the Dogopolitans travelled, no empty lands were to be found, and the goblins became less friendly. Goblin warbands appeared, shadowing the Dogopolitan column. The goblins started demanding tribute in exchange for passage through goblin territories. The Dogopolitans sought refuge on the heights, but they were pursued and attacked. There was a fierce battle in which many of the Dogopolitan menfolk perished, including both Croesus and his younger brother Astrabacchus. The remaining men fought on under the leadership of a man named Damasos, until, surrounded and faced by overwhelming numbers, the survivors laid down their arms and passed into captivity, along with all their women and children. Many of the defeated Dogopolitans had fled Dogopolis with all their movable wealth. The goblins thus came into possession of much livestock, silver coin, and other valuables. They divided this among themselves, and fell to debating what to do with the prisoners. Some of the goblins argued that the Dogopolitans should be enslaved. Others were concerned that such a population of hostile slaves would pose a future threat from within. They argued that the throats of the Dogopolitans should simply be cut and have done with it. Another group sought to combine these positions by suggesting that the male prisoners should be slaughtered and the females enslaved. A more merciful contingent suggested that, rather than being killed, the males should be castrated, as this would make them less warlike and prevent them from breeding. The debate grew heated. At this point, a goblin named Radusan entered the argument. "You are all fools," he said. "If we admit these prisoners into our houses as slaves, then how will we ever sleep sound in our beds at night? And where is the value in slaughtering them? Neither of these proposals is sensible. The only value to be had is if we sell them." It was pointed out to Radusan that the only buyers for slaves in the market were the orcs, and experience showed that attempting to sell anything to orcs inevitably resulted in the theft of the merchandise and the death of the vendor. Radusan shook his head. "The orcs are not the only buyers," he said. "The captives include a woman named Meliti and her 2 children. She is the daughter of Adrastos, a wealthy Dogopolitan merchant and a member of the ruling family. He would pay well for their return, and there are no doubt other captives that we could ransom." It was pointed out that there were some practical difficulties associated with this proposal, not least that Dogopolis was in the hand of the orcs, and Adrastos was probably dead or enslaved, and even if he was free and still in possession of his wealth, how could the goblins contact him? But Radusan had an answer for this. "While you were wasting your time arguing," he said, "I was interrogating Damasos, the leader of the Dogopolitan prisoners. Adrastos was not at Dogopolis when it fell, but at a place called Midhaven, many miles further up the coast. Aristos, the ruler of Dogopolis, also intended to flee to Midhaven, and he will have taken his treasury with him. We goblins are not a seafaring race, but among the captives are men who know the art of shipbuilding. Let us set them building a boat, and then send it to Midhaven with a message for Aristos and Adrastos that, if they send us ships laden with gold, the prisoners will be released to them. But if they do not, or if they try to deceive or trick us in any way, the prisoners' lives will be forfeit." This proposal met with approval. The boat was built. The goblins found a sailor among the captives, a family man, and handed him a message, instructing him to deliver it to Adrastos or Aristos. They also informed him that, if the message was not delivered, or if the ransom was not paid within 1 month, then his family, along with all the other captives, would be put to the sword. The man duly departed on his mission, and sailed along the coast, passing Dogopolis in the hours of darkness, all the way to Midhaven. Aristos was not enthused when he heard of the goblins' demands. The ransom requested was a significant sum, and what would Aristos receive in return? Many hundreds of penniless people, mostly women and children, who seemed likely to be a further burden on the state. He was minded to leave the captives to their fate. Adrastos took a different view. Although he did not have much time for his daughter-in-law, he was quite fond of his grandchildren, and had no desire to leave them to the tender mercies of the goblins. He also saw some longer-term opportunities in the situation. And, as Adrastos pointed out to Aristos, news of the prisoners and their predicament had spread rapidly through Midhaven. Many of the populace had friends and relatives among the captives. If Aristos did nothing to save them, there would be uproar, and his position might be in peril. And so Adrastos' ships were laden with gold from Aristos' treasury, and sailed for the Goblin Downs. The gold was landed, and the prisoners were embarked, and then the ships sailed back to Midhaven, where there was much rejoicing. A couple of months later, one of Adrastos' ships sailed back to the Goblin Downs, putting in at the same anchorage. A crude jetty had been built. Various produce from Midhaven was offloaded from the ship, and various produce from the Goblin Downs was loaded onto it. The ship then sailed back to Midhaven, and that ship was followed by others. Over time, a little port grew up around the jetty. The goblins named this port the Kennels, because it was where they had housed the Dogopolitans. The citizens of Midhaven considered this name to be in poor taste. But Adrastos did not care. He was doing good business. And Aristos did not care. The import duties were refilling his coffers, and, despite their indignation, the citizens of Midhaven were happy to use cheap tools of goblin manufacture and wear tunics made of cheap goblin wool.